Good morning. Welcome to New Writing from Ireland here at the Bay Area Book Festival. My name is Rosemary Graham, and I will be your moderator for today, for our hour this morning with our three writers from Ireland. Before I begin today, I would like to thank Culture Ireland for their sponsorship of this event here, which helps us to bring our writers from Ireland and Canada and abroad. It's just so great, isn't it? How's this? Is this better? All right, here we go. Okay, I guess they meant it when they said we had to be those. Okay. It's so great to be back in person, isn't it? To to have real live writers in our midst, to hold their books in our hands, and also I just enjoyed yesterday so much, just really being a member of an audience. We've made do with remote events. The Bay Area Book Festival has put on many. All the wonderful book festivals in Ireland have put them on, and it's meant we could attend them even if we were in California. But there's really nothing like being in a room and listening to people read aloud, tell their stories, ask questions, and sit and think about them. So thank you to the Bay Area Book Festival and all the work that organization has done to get things, to keep us going here in Berkeley. Today we have three writers from Ireland: Sarah Moss, Colin Barrett, and Claire-Louise Bennett, and I am going to get out of the way and let them introduce themselves and give us a little taste from their work, and then we'll try to get some conversation going among the writers and with you at the end of our hour. So, Sarah Moss.
Is that working properly? Everyone hearing me? No. Even closer. Okay. No, it's turned on here. Okay, shall I just stand up and project? Is that going to... No, it doesn't work.
They're also recording it.
I can't get it much closer without eating it. Keep trying. Any better? Okay. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to hold the book and keep this close to the microphone, but I'll do my best. I'm Sarah Moss. I'm living in Dublin. I've been there 2 years. I'm absolutely delighted to be counted as an Irish writer, but I feel slightly fraudulent in this context. I was born in Scotland and grew up mostly in northern England. I've lived in various places in the meantime. I'm here talking about my 8th novel, which is The Fell. I wrote it pretty much at the time of setting, November 2020. I keep getting the year wrong because who cares what year it is during a pandemic, but I think November 2020 is correct. I'm going to read one paragraph. We challenged ourselves to find one paragraph that would introduce our writing to you. This is the main character, Kate, who is about to break quarantine and go for a walk in the hills when she's supposed to be staying indoors. She's in her garden at this point. There's birdsong now, some small piping voice in the hedge. Wind, not much, in the bare apple tree. From here she can see across the fields to the hill, where the bracken is dying and the heather dull brown. It feels like another country up there, especially in winter when there's no one around, when you can walk an hour or two before you see someone else, you and the wind and the sky. She can see from here there's no one on the path. She'd actually be further from another soul there, less likely to pass on disease than she is here, not 2 meters from Alice's garden, not to mention the Amins on the other side, and Samira in and out of the old folks' homes, so worried she wouldn't come over even in the summer. I'd love to, Kate, you know I would, but with you working in the cafe, it's too much risk. It will be quiet up there, the cloud muffling sound rising from the valley, and if you go far enough over the tops, you come to places where you can't hear traffic. There used to be planes, you used to be able to watch them circling the airport, but now there are only birds. There'll be wind through the sleeping winter heather, and the bracken bright brown, the grass in the bogs grey now and lying long in the pools, and no scent on the wind, just winter. everything biding its time, sleeping and waiting for the darkest days, the hinge of the year and then the return of the light. Leaves gone and branches bare, but the roots still working their way through the earth, the sheep huddled in their wool but pregnant. Kate's back in the house, changing the wellies for hiking boots, taking the backpack she keeps packed for hill walking from under the coats on the hook, filling a water bottle, and she's out of the front door, fast up the path, through the gate and out into the lane. She pulls her hat and gloves from her pockets, puts them on as she walks. She couldn't come within spitting distance of another person if she wanted to out here, and she won't be long, just an hour before sunset. She'll be back before Matt even knows she's gone. I don't think it's too much of a spoiler to say that she won't.
And Colin Barrett, author of Homesickness, which is just out this week here in the United States. It's been out in Ireland and the UK for a couple months.
Yeah, a couple of months. Okay, I think everyone can hear me there. So I'm Colin Barrett, and as Rosemary said, this is my second book of short stories, Homesickness. It's just kind of come out over here in the US and Canada. So it's my first book, Young Skins, was a bunch of stories set in County Mayo, which is kind of where I grew up, where I'm from, really, in the west of Ireland. It's a very rural place, dotted with a few small towns, and all the stories in that were set in Mayo. And then Homesickness is a set of stories set in a slightly more of Mayo, basically. Largely, there is a story set in Toronto as well, actually. So I'm branching out a little bit, but not by much. And I'll just read the opening of the first story in the collection, Shooting in Rathfardown. For those who aren't aware, it references a Garda, and a Garda is just a policeman, a police person, a police officer. It's a Garda. So that's really, I think, all you need to know. Sergeant Jackie Noonan was squaring away paperwork when the call came in. Just her and the Gosling, Punches Swift, in Ballina Garda Station. The third officer on duty, Sergeant Dennis Crane, had run out to oversee the extraction of a Renault Megane, some young lad, sober apparently, just a nervous non-local, negotiating the cat's cradle of back roads around Currabaggan, had nosed into a ditch a half-mile out from the National School. The car was a write-off, but the lad got away without a scratch, according to Crane, and he was a lucky lad, because Noonan knew the roads out that way, and they were wicked, high-ditched, hilly, and altogether too narrow, scantily signposted and laced with half-hidden, acutely right-angled turns it took only a second's inattention to be ambushed by. Noonan was at her desk, drinking coffee black as a vinyl record from a battered silver cafetiere and transferring a weekend's worth of write-ups from her notebook into the central computer system. The weekend had been unremarkable but busy. There'd been a dozen or so minor traffic infractions, a fist fight between Stocious teenage cousins outside a Main Street chipper late last night, and a call out this morning prompted by what turned out to be a man's empty duffel coat snagged in the weir gates of the Mayo River, which was enthusiastically mistaken for a body by a band of visiting American summer students and their professor taking an early constitutional along the quays. I'll just leave it at that.
And if that sounded familiar to any of you, it did. It was in the New Yorker sometime in was it this year? Not too long ago. Yes. I remember seeing it there. So our next visiting writer is Claire-Louise Bennett, who will introduce herself. She's the author of the wonderful novel Checkout 19, which she's here to tell us about today, and also Pond.
Thank you, Rosemary. Nice to be here. I've been living in Ireland for quite a long time, about 23 years actually. I'm from the southwest of England originally. My first book was Pond. This is my second book, Checkout 19. There's quite a lot about discovering literature, finding books. And so the part I'm going to read out now, there's a lot in it. It's about sharing books and, I don't know, just discovering them. And in their physical sort of sense as well as what they contain, and also about being maybe prevented from reading certain books. So in this scene, the race is at university, and she's kind of knocking about the guy called Dale, who seems to think that there are certain books that maybe she'd be better off not reading for the time being. So here we go. Dale, his name's Dale, right? Dale wrote poetry and read poetry and had plenty of poetry books, including volumes by Anne Sexton and Sylvia Plath, which he made sure to keep out of my reach. Probably if I got my hands on them and read them all up, something terrible would befall me, or else something terrible but infinitesimal already woven into me would get notions and take over. And what on earth then? Women can't withstand poetry seemed to be Dale's view. Women are beautiful and tender creatures, and poetry breaks them. Of course it does. Poetry rips right through you, makes shit of you. And a man can be made shit of and go on living because no one really minds, not even the man. The man likes it, in fact, likes to be made shit of so that he can sit there and drink his head off and declaim one epithetical thing after another. And all the other interminably taciturn men believe he is an exceptional man, a man taking a hit for them all, a hero, really, a ramshackle hero they'd love to raise up upon their shot-to-fuck shoulders, or else roll about in the muck with. But wasn't he a down-to-earth sort of a fellow, after all? But it's dreadful to see a woman who's been made shit of due to her messing about with poetry. And what kind of a woman, anyway, is drawn towards poetry? Only a warped sort of a woman who wants to be made shit of, or else has been made shit of already and wants to lay out the nuts and bolts of it, and in that way not keep it at arm's length any longer. Dale didn't think that that was any kind of rehabilitation, so did not encourage me to read poetry by these women. Showed me instead his own very neat handwriting and terse yet tender verses. And I remember that as well as being an acolyte of Bukowski, he was a fan of E. Cummings, whose phony lowercase initials and self-deprecating tone I couldn't stand. Making yourself small really was the most sly and loathsome ploy for insinuating yourself into a woman's knickers. And there was that suffocatingly drippy line of his about such small hands. And that made me snigger more than once, because Dale did in fact have very small hands. And he often fell asleep with a cigarette in the left one, the right one being employed by a glass of beer around the clock. And he had burns in various states of slow repair all over that hand. And if you said anything to him about them, he would be satisfied you'd notice, yet look at you mock sternly, as if you were only a daft goose, who could never quite grasp what it was to be a poet and made shit of. And on such occasions, Dale would be inclined to call me woman, which, I presumed, was his way of getting across that he was a man.
Thank you. That was wonderful. And that reminds me that I could see as I was sitting next to Claire-Louise here, I think I saw your theater, your maybe roots in theater. I don't know if you would use that word or not, emerge, but I wanted to tell you all that the audiobook of Checkout 19 is read by the author. And so if you enjoyed that, you can enjoy the whole book being read to you as it is meant to be read by Claire-Louise. So that makes me think also, let me start with a question that was maybe down in my list of questions, but to ask each of you, or and really as much as you can also jump in and ask each other questions, that's fine. But I would just start with Claire-Louise and ask about your, to talk about how you became a writer. I mean, this book is very, very much about reading and writing and books. And if you would share with us that transition, and a couple of transitions really, but from England to Ireland, and if it is from theater to writing, or whatever you want to do with that.
That's like my life story, really. Well, I've always written. I wrote as a child, and the beginnings of that is something that I reflect on and is explored a bit in the book. But it was a really long time before I thought about trying to publish work. I just felt like I just wanted to do it sort of privately for a really long time, and not necessarily because I find it therapeutic or anything like that, because I don't particularly. But I think the things I was writing for a long time, they didn't really fall into any sort of particular category. So it was very difficult to see how they would be taken, actually accepted for publication, because there's quite sort of clear ideas about things sort of, adhering to certain forms, short story, all that kind of thing. And I just wasn't really doing anything that satisfied any of those. So that was a bit frustrating. But then, it just took a long time. It just took a really, really long time. I was in my 30s, really, when I started to send off work then. And I got it to a stage where I was getting kind of happy with it, even though it wasn't really conforming to any particular genre or form. It was rigorous enough at that stage. The standard of it was good, and I thought, well, that should carry it really. So, yeah, that's a bit of it.
Do you think that living in Ireland helped you to claim the writing as a vocation in any way? I mean, it's okay if the answer is no. Was it Ireland where that happened? Where you living in?
Yeah. I mean, as I explained a bit in a panel yesterday. So I grew up in England in a fairly working class kind of background. So the notion of you being a writer, I mean, it just wasn't something that you would really think, because writers don't really make that much money. And a really important thing that's kind of instilled in you in a working class family from quite a young age is you're going to have to sort of fend for yourself. And it's really scary, actually. I sort of remember that point when it suddenly dawned on me, oh God, I've actually got to, I'll have to earn some money and buy all the things I need, all my own breakfast cereals and shoes and God knows what else, how am I going to do that? It's really scary in a way. I just thought I'm not going to be able to. And then I did jobs and they were really boring. And I just thought, oh, wow, is this going to be the way it is then for, forevermore? It's really crap. So I left England, because my parents just kept asking me questions about, what I was going to do and this kind of thing. And just, really. And where I lived at the time was the fastest growing town in Europe. So there was a lot of work, but really not very good work, just boring work. And I was indoors all day, every day. And I really didn't like being indoors that much. It really frustrated me. So I basically just ran away. And I went to Galway, which was great because there was no jobs at all. So it's kind of funny because I always say the Irish came over to England to get work and I went over to Ireland to avoid it. It was really bad.
So, Colin and Sarah, could you also talk about just becoming writers and how becoming a writer in Ireland for Colin and England for Sarah?
I'd also always wanted to be a writer and wrote in childhood. In fact, one of the pleasures for me of my recent emigration from England to Ireland was finding all of my teenage writing and destroying it so that nobody will ever read it. It's actually a great relief to me that is no longer in the world. I always wrote, but I had no idea how you might make the transition from writing in a notebook in your bedroom to publishing. And I had an academic career before I switched over to the dark side of creative writing. I used to teach 18th, 19th century English literature. And increasingly that just began to feel very fake because I was teaching students that they really shouldn't be, falling in love with Mr. Rochester or swooning over Byron. Not they do that very much these days. But meanwhile, I was writing characters with whom I absolutely wanted readers to fall in love. And it just seemed so strange to be teaching them not to read the way that I wanted people to read my own writing. So I stepped over into creative writing. Yeah, I think that's kind of how.
And when you say
write
not
it.
fall in love with, you mean because the scholarly world was asking them to analyze and theorize instead of.
I don't think there's anything wrong with analysis and theory. And I think it's a thing I say often to students. I think there are very many different ways of reading, and they're all absolutely fine. I mean, you can read in the bath for escapism. You can read in bed at 2 a.m. because you can't sleep. You can read at your desk because you're reading something really clever that requires you to be at your desk and being clever about it. And I think those are all just different ways of engaging with literary texts, and they're all okay. I'd really reject the sense that there's a hierarchy there.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And Colin, would you talk about your own little bit?
Yeah, I mean, same deal, really. You know, I always had notions of wanting to write from when I was quite young. I'd always enjoyed, you know, drawing little comic books, writing stories, creating little narratives when I was young. I didn't even really think about the viability of making a living out of it or anything. Although I guess I assumed wrongly that if someone has a book in a bookstore, they must be doing okay, you know. I just, yeah, I mean, I suppose the main thing was I moved from Mayo to Dublin to go to college. And when I was up there, I was working in a call center after I finished. I did again, I thought wrongly, I'll do an English degree. That'll surely help me become a writer. Everyone must love English. Why else would they be doing this course if they didn't love reading and writing? And although I read barely anything on the prescribed reading lists, but I did spend a lot of time in UCD library just reading, you know, whatever you know, shit I was into at the time. But they had it all. It was great, you know. So it was always something I kind of wanted to do. I think as Claire-Louise and Sarah said, just did it for myself. Did it just you know, I took it very seriously, but it was just a totally thing I did for myself, and I didn't show anyone any writing for years either. But to cut a long story short, I mean, in Dublin, I became aware of there was a spate of literary journals that just started up, and it was eventually my first publisher, the Sting of Fly Press. They ran a literary journal, and it's been running, I think, nearly 30 years now or something. Or it was a long time, yeah. I think it's the longest running Irish one ever, I think. And so just discovering that copies of that, and it was full of they were literally looking for new writers. Again, I just thought writing was something a lot of dead people had done, and now we read their books in, you know, or people from New York or something. They could be alive, they could tell stories. But so I discovered that magazine and discovered Irish writers who were sort of still in the development stages, or maybe had a book out, just people who were contemporaries or near contemporaries. And that just seemed like a route. And it was a very modest thing. So can I write a story? I fell in love with the short story form. And I just thought, you know, when I think I have a story good enough, I'll send it to them. And then about 4 years later, I sent them something. So that was it, really. I mean, I ended up getting published by them, and there was just a living community around me of readings, and you could go to watch people read their work and stuff. So I went from being completely on the outside and having never met a writer to meeting people who were just like me and who were just trying to write. So that was the journey.
That's great that you mentioned that. I brought some show and tell items. I am a teacher, and but I brought a copy of The Stinging Fly because I know that the readers in this room are interested in Irish literature, and you can subscribe to The Stinging Fly, and they will send you a volume several times a year. And it's really it's a beautiful literary magazine, just physically, and you can read up and coming as well as established Irish writers in it. And I brought another a publication which I saw Sarah mentioned in an interview. It's a publication called, well, it started out as Winter Pages, and now it's called Winter Papers. It's published by the writer Colin Barrett and his wife Olivia Smith. It's an annual, once a year, and it's another beautiful, I mean, you can't get more beautiful than this in terms of the way it's put together. I don't think they do anything online at all. I don't know if you can find a story. It's just, you have to commit to it, and you can have it shipped, or you can, if you are traveling to Ireland, you can find it in the bookstores. I went back to look at my first issue, and Colin is in volume 1. and Claire-Louise is in volume 6, a very interesting piece, a collaborative work that I'd love to, which, you know, you talked about sort of form, and you know, it's just wonderful that they publish things that are you probably couldn't maybe publish anywhere else. I mean, it's a visual piece as well as, you know, it's experimental in its form. So I wanted to mention that. But I read, the reason I brought these is that I read an interview with Sarah where she said that, or maybe I should just let you say it, but that you saw this, you saw the pandemic sort of coming through in pieces there. And I don't know if you want to elaborate on that at all.
Yeah, I was reviewing it, actually. I was reviewing it for the Irish Times, which was a really lovely thing to start doing recently after moving to Ireland. And it's interesting because the way I remember it is actually not the way it is. What I remembered was that quite a lot of the essays, mostly in that volume of the winter papers, were beginning to engage with the pandemic. It was the first time that I'd seen COVID and lockdown beginning to appear in print. And one of the more tedious questions people were asking at the beginning of lockdown was, well, you know, how are the writers going to deal with this? Because you can't write about COVID, but are you going to invent a fantasy version of 2020 that doesn't have COVID in it? It's never been clear to me why you can't write about COVID. I'm still completely mystified by this. And I still know writers who were saying, oh, well, I'm setting my book in a kind of parallel reality 2019 where the pandemic doesn't happen. And I think, why? And how long are we going to go on doing that? You know, at what point is literature and life allowed to converge here? But anyway, they were converging very early in the winter papers. And that made me think, okay, you know, we don't have to be silent anymore. This event does not mean that we're all muffled. There are going to be ways of including this experience in art and literature and music. And that felt quite important to me, that it wasn't just something that had to be escaped or evaded, that we would be able to find ways of looking at it and incorporating it into culture. And that was one of the starting points for writing The Fell.
And Sarah, I only learned by doing my background reading on you that your first novel is about a fictional epidemic. That must have been a little odd for you.
It was extremely convenient for me. I'd written a novel about a global pandemic, and then the World Health Organization declared swine flu to be a global pandemic on the day of publication.
Very good timing.
Yes. I mean, you know, one is never grateful, of course, for a pandemic, but if it was going to happen, that was certainly the day for it.
To go back a little bit to the question of becoming a writer, Colin, I have a very specific question. Well, first of all, I want to mention, Colin, you deal with the pandemic in one of your stories, the Black Drone story.
Yeah,
that's your Canada story as well.
Yeah, so I have one story in there that's set in Toronto, and where I now live and have lived for a few years, and it's set during the pandemic. Yeah, and it was written in 2020. It was one of the last stories I wrote, and I suppose it's quite different to a lot of the other ones. It's in first person. It's you know, it's very of the moment. It's not of when I was writing it, when I was composing it. I was just sort of putting everything into it that was kind of happening in and around the city. I mean, I had a kind of kernel of a story to put around it too, but it seemed like a good opportunity to write about Toronto, which I hadn't like deliberately not written about, but it just hadn't. I you know, I'd work to be going out, and it was all set in Mayo basically. You know, there's always this delay on these things when they happen to you, and it just sort of, but experiencing the lockdown and all that stuff and the eerie emptiness of a big city for those months was obviously, like, you know, you didn't want the pandemic, but it was inspiring. So let's get some material out of it. Let's get some, you know, and so I did deal with it too, and I guess in a roundabout way it allowed me to write about Toronto, because I suppose part of the thing about, I feel like my writing is very rooted in community and place and stuff, and I still maybe felt on some level that I don't know Toronto well enough yet, or can I write about this? There's plenty of Canadian authors, and but the pandemic was a nice sort of a weird event that just made it put everything to zero again. No matter where you were, everyone was beginning in this new reality at zero, so it allowed me to write about it. So I did kind of just have I think an involuntary received wisdom of, well, is anyone going to want to read about the pandemic once it's gone or once it's been normalized, rather than can we write about it? And so I kind of didn't want to do the story, but it only worked when it was set during the pandemic. So yeah, went for it.
I'm really interested by what you say about moving and where you write about, because I'm absolutely in that stage at the moment. I don't feel I can set a new work in Ireland because I haven't been there long enough. But I also don't feel I can go on setting things in England because I haven't been there at all in the last 2 years. So how long did it take you to start to feel that you could write about Canada? It sounds as if I've got a few more years to wait.
Yeah.
That was, that was like 4.5 years, and that was certainly early because I didn't plan to, and I don't think I would have if it wasn't for the pandemic. But as I say, yeah, it's not really. If I had what I thought was a story I could tell set there, I'd give it a go. But I still very much just living in my memories and in my sensibilities. It's still very much molded by where I have spent the majority of my life, but I haven't been there for a long time, and it's all the usual things. It's not being there regularly anymore sharpens your memories and your senses and whatnot. So, and it's often, that stuff is often sharper than what is happening around you every day. And it's only then when you shift out of there, even if not physically, but once I've been in Toronto long enough, I think that I have a store of memories that kind of I've moved away from. I think maybe it will start coming into the writing more clearly then. But how long that is, I don't know.
That leads me to a question that I will ground in Claire-Louise's book, and let me see if I have my little note there. But there's a point in Checkout 19, Claire-Louise, where you write about accents and about let me see if I can find the spot. Let me just describe it, because I don't want to. You read your own work so much better, but there's your character is talking about how her own West Country accent got stronger away from home, while she meets her brother who has shed his, and it has to do with identity. It has to do with identity, but it also has to do with class. And so my question is about whether your own relationship to your relationship to the English language, has Ireland changed English for you, and is that too light area question, but if I you talked about, the character talks about also having her English accent being an issue when she settles into the country as well. But
yeah, I mean, not so much there. I was thinking about accent because after I moved over to Ireland, I didn't really go back to England very much at all. I might go every 18 months, 2 years. So I wouldn't really go back for things like Christmas and stuff, because it's a nightmare. But then when I got published, and I think I'd been in Ireland for quite a long time by then. It's like I've been there 15 years already. So then I got published, and by the Stinging Fly, same publisher as Colin, and then in the UK by Fitzcarraldo. So then I was going over to England quite frequently then, like for the first time in years, to do events like this. And so those kinds of events, they tend to be, particularly in London, I suppose, they tend to be sort of quite fairly middle class affairs, really. And really, it was the first time in years that I realized I kind of had an accent, and I became aware of my working class roots, I suppose. I hadn't thought about it for years. It's not because Ireland is a classless society, because it isn't. It's structured slightly differently. We're very differently, and it's not quite as entrenched as it is in the UK. But anyway, I'm not part of it in Ireland. People can't really place me. So I've kind of enjoyed feeling pretty like classless for years. And then I'm doing these events in England, and I'm like, whoa, actually. So I was kind of confronted with my working class self, I suppose. And that raised a lot of questions for me. And I just started to see a lot of different things about my life in a different light. And then, I came across an article in a newspaper, The Guardian, which was talking about how certain students in universities in the UK get picked on, right? So we're talking about university, right? They get picked on for having accents, regional accents. So there's this kind of a pressure then and some of the students were interviewed, and they talked about not then speaking up in class, not feeling like they can ask questions or contribute to discussions because other students kind of, snigger and roll their eyes and this kind of thing. And also, actually, staff had said to, there's a college up in the north of England, Durham, which is quite, but I mean, it's in the north, right? And so a student had a northern accent, and the teacher had said to them, "You sound stupid when you talk." I mean, so that kind of weaved in to the book as well, because it just made me feel so angry reading that. You're just made to feel, and I don't think classism is really talked about enough, really, in the UK at all, and it's pretty, it's so embedded. Like, people just make quite strong assumptions, not even consciously, the moment they hear another person speak. Wouldn't you agree with that, Sarah?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I grew up in the north of England and I didn't used to sound like this. And my accent still changed. My husband always says my accent changes as we drive down the M1, that, he knows how far north we are because my vowels are shifting. But that was to do with going to Oxford at 18 and very quickly working out that people who sounded like me didn't belong. So, yes, I have a friend who does sociolinguistics, and he has this lovely statistic that in Denmark, it takes nearly 11 minutes for somebody to place, when they're talking to somebody, to place their accent. In England, it's 4 seconds. Wow. And you can label somebody by where they come from, what class they are, how much money their parents have, where they were educated.
It's that quick. And like I said, all the assumptions are clicking in then. Yeah. Based on that.
I think I forgot to mention the silencing the phone, but we got it. Okay. I love that. So, Colin, tell us something about Ireland and accents then. How long does it take? Would it be more geographic?
Ireland and accents, yeah. There's a lot of them. Even in Mayo, it'd be hard to, there's people with an educated enough ear that are going to know. They can tell you're from 10 miles down the road and you're from 15 miles down the road.
I think that's in your story. Is that in the story, this police story?
Probably something like that. But there's a lot of. I mean, I grew up, very much in the countryside, and kind of there is like the better off areas, and there's always going to be a layer of white collar jobs, and upper middle class people even in small towns, and then there's people who the sort of more working class background and stuff. But I mean, it's hard to talk about because it does take on different formations, but it's certainly, from what I can gather, it's not as pronounced, and as both were saying, not as entrenched. There's the current class formations in Ireland isn't all that old as opposed to England, given the history of the country. So it doesn't mean it's not there, but it does manifest in different ways, and I think maybe that will become more pronounced as time goes on, unfortunately.
And I think of it as so very geographic too, right? And that's Sarah, are you finding? How are you finding? Maybe you haven't been there long enough, but is Ireland changing your ear?
No, it's absolutely changed my ear. I think I've moved a lot, and I think it's partly because I really enjoy outsider status. I find it very, very stimulating. And I was thinking when Colin was talking about being in Canada and the way the place you came from kind of ossifies, I think, actually, in your memory. I was thinking about Joyce in Trieste. You know, the exile's position can be quite tempting. For me, what I hear on a daily basis makes a big difference to my writing, which is why I think I'm slightly stuck with writing at the moment, because I'm hearing Irish English. I'm not ready to write Irish English. I don't inhabit it, but it fascinates me, and I'm hearing it all the time, and it's a different cadence and a different rhythm, and the words just fall differently. And I love it. I like the way it makes me listen, but it's not mine. So yeah, it kind of productive pause at the moment.
I did want to also ask Colin very specifically about your working. Was in your story. Which one is it? Whoever you are, come on through. It's a very fun story about a depressed person who comes home.
Fun story about a depressed person.
It's a fun story.
Didn't catch
that. A character named Mert, and he joins a local creative writing class, and one of his classmates teases him and says, "I don't think he'll have Colm Tóibín shaking in his boots anytime soon." No. But you do have a special relationship with your countryman Colm Tóibín.
I wrote that story before I met Colm Tóibín, and I was just I needed the name of a fairly famous, renowned and good Irish writer, so I happened to stick Colm in there. He joins a writing group, kind of just to have something to do, and it's part of a sort of just getting back on his feet and all that. And so an older fella that there is very derisive about his writing abilities, but you're going to get that. Since then I spent a few years getting to work with Colm through a mentorship thing that's run by Rolex, the watch people. This
is what I wanted to ask. I wanted to ask whether you got a Rolex as part of that program.
Yeah, they gave me one. Yeah.
Oh, you do? Yeah. Then do you wear it when you go home in Mayo?
No, I'm scared of wearing it. I have hidden it away. It's too expensive. But we got to spend 3 years just in it's a mentorship thing. So you kind of would just periodically meet. And I mean, Colm is a very, very lovely man, very down to earth, no airs and graces. Just genuinely very interested in new writing and writers he doesn't know and writers who are up and coming. And so he just talked to me completely unpatronizingly and completely without it. He would discuss the difficulties he was having writing his current book or whatever, and I would ask him advice about mine. And so it was a very lovely thing to get to do. But yeah, it was also funny that, and I think I submitted that story as I got invited to do the mentorship thing, and so you had to submit a sample of writing. I don't think I knew he was the guy. He was the person at the time. So I submitted this story. I mean, it was someone else judging it, but nonetheless, it was. He's read it since subsequently. So, but it's not it's a compliment to Colm. Oh. So, it's the guy in the story who's getting trashed. So.
I'm happy to hear that explanation. I thought it was a wink. I thought it was perhaps an inside joke between the two of you. So
no, it genuinely was written. It was written like a year beforehand. So it had been one of the last things I'd written when I got invited to apply. So it had been in the New Yorker and stuff. So I was like, I'm going to put it in it was happenstance, but very funny.
Well, I think that probably some of our members of our audience would love a chance to talk to our writers and ask questions. And so I'd like to take a moment now. We have a microphone. And so if you are interested in asking a question, if you could raise your hand, and Kate will come over and help to amplify your voice.
questions?
Hi, I'm just curious about not so much accents, but the issue of Irishness. I'm an Irish American, and I have to admit I'm nostalgic, and I read Irish literature. Am I not being heard? Oh, these microphones. Okay.
There we go.
I'm Irish American, and I read Irish literature because I want it to be Irish. I want Irishness. So I want like local color and like good restaurants in Galway and things like that. Is there pressure to write, if you're an Irish writer, to write Irishness into your writing? Or can you just be Canadian?
Suppose I'll take that one. No, I mean, you're kind of lucky. I mean, I was lucky simply because Irish writing has a pretty, in the English language in the 20th century, 21st century, has a pretty high profile already, and I think it's pretty widely read. So, it tends to, among people who are interested in writing, I mean, I think, and reading, they're going to probably know and read and have in rotation at least a few Irish writers. So it wasn't like just even the nuts and bolts of getting a publisher outside of Ireland or it was never an issue. Like my first book of stories, my question was who is going to want to read these? It's all set in this small town in the west coast of Ireland, and it's very, they're not, it's very local concerns and written in inspired by and out of a very specific temperament and way of being, and I always wondered, would anyone want to read these? But the stories did manage to travel, and the Irishness. I mean, it's never been something I've been asked to or felt I've had to write towards, But I write about a very particular kind of community and about very particular Irish place. So I guess I guess it's just steeped in Irishness anyway. How that. If there's an image of that, a worldwide image of that you have to write towards, it's not something I seriously wondered about. I just sort of did. I was more worried about like where the people I was from would think of the authenticity of the stories rather than anyone else, because I didn't know if anyone else would be interested in them. So I guess that was where my concerns about their authenticity began and end, was the people I know, would they buy it? Would they accept it? So. And
how do the people at home respond to your work?
All the ones who I've met have been pretty positive, but I mean, you're going to get positive bias that way. They're the ones who are going to show up and come to your reading. But no, everyone was very nice. Everyone's been very nice about it, and you're always worried you'll be chased out of town, for writing the scandal. But everyone was very, very kind and very, very understanding.
You hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. This is another question for Colin. I was very interested in knowing, having just read, listened to Young Skins, because I come from Ireland as well, and I know kind of when you write about things in Ireland or a small town, and do you have people coming up to you say, "Am I that person?" Or how do you respond to that? Like if people come up to you and say, "Is this me in your writing?"
Yeah, I mean. I didn't base any characters on anyone specific, and I just had this sort of like aggregate store of like daft things I remember people doing. But no, I the opposite. Friends of mine just like cornered me and went, "Hey, put me in a story. Why am I in it? Take out these losers. Put me in. Put someone cool in." And so that's I mean, they were annoyed they hadn't been in it, rather than they weren't. So. I always think anyway, if you put someone in, they'll read it and they'll be like, "God, that character is such a loser. Where'd you come up with them?" or whatever, So I don't know if people would necessarily recognize themselves. But my problem was the opposite. I had people who wanted to, be in the stories once they were out in the world. They wanted to taste that, so I had to promise to put them in sooner or later.
Wanted to ask about language some more. One, in terms of you're all expats, and so how does the different ways of speaking English translate into your writing. And I imagine dialogue is one place where that would be an issue. And then also particular to Ireland, where or if Gaelic is part of the literary scene there. I know like in Nova Scotia, there's quite a Gaelic renaissance going on.
Who wants to? The Irish language.
Okay, so I'm obviously in some ways the least qualified person to answer this question, which is why I grabbed the microphone. This is on the basis of my office in UCD being in the corridor with Irish and folklore. Just fine basis for a statement. Yes, there is Irish language publication and there are rising writers in Irish. My impression is there's not a lot of overlap. There's not a lot of self-translation going on. I don't know what you two would say about that. I'd really like to complicate some of this idea of Irishness because there is, Ireland is in the modern world in the same way as everywhere else and does have people who come from, and I think the idea of who comes from a place is always extremely complicated, but there are now two generations of Irish people and Irish writers who would claim to come from all kinds of other places. So I think it's quite easy, maybe often particularly from North America, to see Irishness as being associated with pastness and with nostalgia, but the lived reality is not like that.
Yes, of course, because Ireland has become, we tend to think of it, we're in America, Irish Americans, we think of it as the site from which our ancestors emigrated, but it has, of course, become a site of immigration now, and you have an international citizenry in Ireland and lots of wonderful complications from that as well. And right, just when someone asked about Irish language, just the Stinging Fly, pretty much always, there's always some original Irish language work in this publication. That could be an interesting thing to see. Yeah.
Good morning. Thank you. And thank you all for being here. It's been really a pleasure to listen to you so far. My question's for Claire-Louise. I find your voice to be unique in a lovely way. And I wondered about your voice in terms of as a writer, and wondered about who you might say were your influences if you had them. I'm a huge fan of Edna O'Brien, and there's elements of her work that I really appreciate that I think I see in yours, but I don't know that if I'm just making that up because it suits me.
You said Edna O'Brien.
Yeah.
I've read very little of her work, which I need to do something about. I would say, in terms of, I guess, I always find the word voice a kind of a bit of a tricky one, and I don't know why exactly I do, but I think maybe in terms of that kind of that sort of sensibility, Jean Rhys would have been someone I've always loved, and I love the way that on one page she's able to kind of shift through so many different perspectives while she's sitting in a cafe. So there's an immediacy to what she's writing about. We're with her in a place, but she's also, she can shift from a memory to a fantasy to the here and now, to an observation, and it's all kind of, she does that so well. So who else would be? Well, I love Beckett, and I quite like Thomas Bernhard as well. But they weren't writers that I were aware of until kind of later on. I'm just trying to think when I was younger, because I have things from a long time ago, and I haven't destroyed them, but I have given I've told a friend that if anything happens to me, he has to burn them, and he will. I know he will. That's why I asked him. I know other people I wouldn't necessarily trust with that, but he will. And But I can see in those, I keep them. I don't know why particularly, but I guess just to sort of look back and remind myself of the origins, I suppose. And it does surprise me how, in a way, not much has really changed. I mean, I think I'm much more legible now, or, because some of the stuff I was writing a very long time ago, I mean, I can't really make head nor tail of it, to be quite honest with you. I don't know what was going on. So that's why I didn't try and get published for a long time, because it was like, I don't even know what that's about. So no one else is going to have a hope. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know really where I always had a very specific, quite strong sort of particular sort of cadence, I suppose, and a way of arranging sentences, and that's always kind of been there, really. I don't know, but something that I also talk about in Checkout 19, even though a lot of it is about books and reading and literature, it's also about spoken language and things that I would have heard growing up, and I love that. I love family sayings. There's a beautiful book by an Italian writer, actually, Natalia Ginsburg. She's excellent. She's worth checking out. And it's about those sayings that we have in all of our families. They just sort of come out of little kind of events, and they get stuck then, don't they? And just saying them evokes so much. So that's really contributed, and particularly hearing the way that my grandmothers would have spoken. And I mean, one of my grandmothers, I mean, she barely left the county of Wiltshire. She certainly didn't ever go abroad. She might have gone to Weston-super-Mare a couple of times. So her language and her sayings was very kind of specific to the area I grew up in. And my dad's the same. My dad's a plumber. He doesn't really read. Well, I think he's been reading actually in recent years, but he certainly didn't read when I was growing up. He didn't have time. He'd be tired. But I love his use of language. It's really piratey. It's really sort of visceral and a bit like gross. Like you go I remember going into the kitchen. I was a kid, and he'd make a kind of a fry up on a Saturday, and he was, I think, cutting up some mushrooms with a ridiculously big knife. There was no need for him to use such a big knife to cut mushrooms. And then he looked at me and he had the knife and he was like, I'll run you through and rip out your gizzards. And I was like, yeah, all right, morning, hi. And he was just like, he loved words like boils and carbuncles. And I had athlete's foot or something once, and he went, oh, you got trench foot. And I went, what? Oh, look at it. It's going to fall off. You're going to get gangrene. You got trench foot. I was like, yeah, all right, Dad. It's just, yeah, I had this lovely kind of very piratey, and he loved sort of like goiters and things and just stuff. It was just really very visceral. So that's definitely, that very piratey sort of way is definitely in there as well. And I really enjoy it. I really enjoy that aspect as well. So yeah, just to finish, so there's a lot of shifting of kind of registers then in my book to reflect that, and that idea of, I suppose, how sort of multifaceted our voices are, and like there's so many things that contribute to them, like someone is, Beckett and my dad, two completely different lexicons, and yet somehow, they're all part of my verbal world.
Our final question.
Thank you all for being here. My question is, do any of you have the desire to spend any time living in a non-English speaking country? And if so, which country and why? Would it be for your writing or for other reasons?
I have lived in Iceland for a year, which was interesting for my writing. I think, again, it's about outsider status, but you also develop a very particular relationship with language when the language in your head is not the one that you're hearing around you. I've spent a lot of time in France and Germany, but I speak French and German, so that's different, but also exciting. I mean, that constant translation that goes on if you're not as fluent as you could be, but able to function in another language. I'd love to spend more time in Japan, and I have absolutely no Japanese. It's the foreignness of it that appeals so much.
Yeah, it is quite interesting. I lived in France just for 8 months. I'm so bad at learning languages. I've really tried to learn French any number of times, but it just, the only sentence, I'm not even going to say it actually because I get it wrong. So, it means, I'll bring it over to you, which is not that useful. I don't tend to wait on people that much. So chances of me like saying, I'll bring it over to you, it's not going to happen that often. I really like the desert. I spent some time in Morocco and I'd love to spend some time there. And if I did spend some time there, it wouldn't be anything to do with writing. Though there is a writer who lived in Tangier for a long time, Paul Bowles, and his partner Jane, and I love their work. Yeah, a lot. It's interesting. It's an interesting place. There's problems with it, but for women and so on. But it's an interesting place. I like Morocco a lot.
Oh, I'll just add my thoughts, which is that there's lots of places I'd love to go and visit, but I would just fuck around and not write. So I need the most boring routine. Like I just need the most steady routine. Like I need nothing to be happening in my life really to write consistently. So anywhere that would be too interesting or too just too various in its experiences would absolutely just I wouldn't get any work done. So.
We want to keep Colin and Claire-Louise and Sarah writing, and we want to thank them today for their... Thank you.